Hey everybody, and welcome to Dominion Cards. This is a video series where we take a strategic, in-depth look at various cards from the board game Dominion. Today we're looking at Bureaucrat. Bureaucrat is a 4-cost action and attack card from the base game, and it says gain a silver onto your deck. Each other player reveals a victory card from their hand and puts it onto their deck, or reveals a hand with no victory cards. So there's two things going on here, so let's take a look at the top one first. So, before we talk about the silver gaining, we need to talk about silver itself. So silver's pretty mediocre. You usually want 1 at the start of the game because it gives you money and that helps you buy the better cards that you would rather have. Silver's pretty weak and it has to be in the game because it's always available. So if it was really strong, then you just wouldn't be buying anything else other than silver. So, it's good that it's weak, but it is just weak. Usually, therefore, while you're fine to have 1 or 2 silvers at the start of the game, you usually don't want a lot of them. Silver is a lot worse than gold. If we consider a deck that for some reason isn't going to get golds but wants a lot of silvers, you would need your deck to be roughly like 70% made of silver cards in order to buy province reliably. Now, obviously, if you're getting a lot of silvers, you don't really have any other cards to do anything else like draw, so that's why we can say that if you think about the 5-card hands that you would have in a deck made mostly of silvers, you need to buy a province. You need either 3 silvers and 2 coppers, or you're going to need 4 silvers, or you're going to need 5 silvers. So, that's a lot of silvers that you need. And so what we call silver floods, which is where you're trying to get a lot of silvers into your deck, these are not actually very good most of the time. Silver's just not good enough as a card to help you get province without like gold as a support. If you do want to go for a silver flood, gaining 1 extra silver a turn is just not good enough. You cannot get to a high enough density of silver with just a silver gained in a silver board every turn. There are some cards that will give you silvers a lot more than that, and Bureaucrat is not one of those cards, unfortunately. So it's pretty bad at silver flooding your deck. Now, Bureaucrat doesn't just gain a silver, it top decks the silver. Unfortunately, if you're going to gain a silver, having it go straight onto the top of your deck is often the worst possible place to put it when you gain it. So the thing is that in most decks, what you want to do is you want to try and draw all of it, and you're going to have you'd ideally like your villages to be first, and then like your draw cards, and then all of your stock card payload to be drawn at the end. You certainly don't really want the silvers at the start if you can help it. Now, the order is, of course, totally random, and that ideal basically never happens, but you don't really want to guarantee to get the worst possible draw if you can help it. The problem with having the silver at the start of your turn is that it makes it much harder to connect the villages and the draw cards together. You just have less other cards available in your hand to actually do what you need to do to start drawing your deck, basically. Now, that doesn't mean that the silver has to stay on top of your deck. You could then play another action card that draws that silver immediately. The problem is that you still need to have a spare action left after playing Bureaucrat to play another card, like a cantrip or another draw card. And that's just means that you don't really want to be ending your turn by playing Bureaucrat, so you still need all that extra village support and stuff. So it's just a thing to recognise that you have to do. Once you've played the Bureaucrat, there's just more that you still have to do to stop it hurting you. Bear in mind that if you drew your entire deck and then played Bureaucrat and you top deck the silver, like in those sort of cases, if it had gone in the discard instead, if you wanted to play it this turn, you'd still need to draw it anyway, and it wouldn't be so bad. But in a lot of cases, the fact that the silver would go in your discard pile means it guarantees that it comes last, so that would be a little bit better in those cases. So, yeah, top decking silver, not actually very good in engines. You really don't want it to do that. But I hear you say, what if it's not an engine, right? What if we had a treasure strategy instead? Well, hey, gaining a bunch of silver sounds really good for a deck that's mostly made of treasure, right? Yeah, it is. That is true. Problem is that Bureaucrat just isn't a very good treasure deck enabler. There are many other cards that are available that also gain you silvers, but they do so in a much better way for treasure strategies. Bureaucrat doesn't help you on your current turn. You'll notice it's not got any plus coins, it's not got any plus cards on it or anything like that. What it does is it gets you the silver and it sticks it there for next turn instead of now. So it's pretty slow as far as a silver gainer goes. You can usually do better than Bureaucrat, so it's not very good in these types of decks either. It usually loses out to something that can do it just better instead. Okay, so now let's move on to the second part of Bureaucrat, which is the attack part. So in theory, it sounds quite nice, right? If your opponent has a victory card in their hand, they put that victory card back on top of their deck, and now the next time they draw a card, it's that victory card again, right? They lose a draw, or they could, even if they can't draw this turn, that means next turn they're in the same situation. That victory card is back in their hand. And also, this is a stackable attack. So if they have multiple victory cards and you can play multiple Bureaucrats, then, they're top decking quite a lot of stuff. And that sounds, in theory, pretty damaging. There is a problem, though. That is, of course, they've got to have victory cards in their hand. So at the start of the game, everyone has estates. The problem is that the estates are so bad that if there's anything you're going to want to trash first, it's usually the estates. So the estates are like the number one target for getting trashed really early. And when that is possible in a game, that means for most of the game, your opponent actually won't have any victory cards in their deck at all. And that means that Bureaucrat's attack is always going to miss. Right? If they've got no victory cards, the attack does absolutely nothing, and that's the state people actually want to be in most of the time, where they don't have any victory cards. And even if they cannot trash the estates, the reality is that as they build their deck, those estates just become a smaller and smaller proportion of the deck, and so the odds that they have one in their hand just goes down and down and down as the game goes on. So it's still going to miss pretty often, even if they can't trash them. So Bureaucrat, its attack, it misses a lot. And the worst bit is that every time you want to try and attempt to attack your opponent, it's going to gain you a silver. Now, you might think, hey, Bandit, there's a card. It's a terminal stop card. It gains you a treasure, and then it has an attack that misses most of the time. So how is that card good and Bureaucrat is a lot worse? That is because silver is just so much worse than gold. Like, it's not even funny. Gold is significantly better than silver most of the time. Silver is a card that you do not want many copies of, and if you think that silver is a stop card that you don't want a lot of the time, well, that's no different from other junk cards like Curse or Copper. So in a bunch of decks, when you play Bureaucrat, it's sort of like junking yourself. And that can mean that in certain decks, Bureaucrat is actually worse for you than it is for your opponent, which is quite funny. They get a little top deck, and it's like, that sucks for them, but you junked yourself, and junking is like the worst possible attack most of the time. So, Bureaucrat is sometimes more harmful for you than it is for your opponent. Now, it is a stackable attack, so when you have more than two players, it can get stronger. This means that, it's more likely that when you do have more than one victory card in your hand, you are actually going to get hit more than once and top deck them both. And also, because it's more likely to fly out if everyone's playing Bureaucrats, when you do eventually draw a victory card into your starting hand, you might well get hit by it. But the truth is that it's still not great, even with more than two players. It's just a bad card overall. Now, if we want to try and make the most of that attack, can we do that? Can we reliably get that attack off every time we play Bureaucrat? Well, one thing that you could do is to say, okay, how can we guarantee that our opponent is going to have at least one victory card in their hand when they're sitting between turns? Now, there are some attacks like Rabble from Prosperity that will look to try and put victory cards at the top of their deck. Now, that's not the same thing. When you play a Rabble and top deck the victory card, that victory card is not in your opponent's hand. And if they had, say, their own Rabble, they can draw those up on their next turn, and then they won't be in their starting hand on the next turn. There is an attack called Haunted Woods in Adventures, and it is the only card that can really do what we want here. Haunted Woods will let your opponent have their turn and draw their deck, and then as soon as they buy something, all of those victory cards get top-decked for their next turn, so they start their next turn with those cards. And because that happens in the buy phase, they usually don't have a chance to actually clean their deck up after that. So Haunted Woods and Bureaucrat can be thought of as sort of a combo. I have actually had a game before where this was a pretty powerful pin on my opponent. They would buy Haunted Woods. They would buy a card, and I had a Haunted Woods. All of their cards would go on top of their deck, and then I had 2 Bureaucrats that I played Throne Room on my turn, and they had to put 4 of those victory cards into their next hand. So it screwed up 2 of my opponent's hands. Now, how often do you really see this? Very rarely. There's a lot more you have to do to make it work, right? You've got to also have the ability to have a engine that draws the deck, and I had to have a way to play a lot of Bureaucrats, and I had to have a way to deal with the silvers that came from the Bureaucrats. So this is exceptionally unlikely, but it can happen, so I mention it here, and it has in fact happened with me once before. Sometimes you get victory cards that are actually helpful. So in Intrigue, for example, the first expansion, there's a card called Mill and a card called Nobles. Those are action cards, but they also give you points. So they are action and victory mixed types. These get hit by Bureaucrat's attack. So if Nobles in particular, for example, it is an engine component. It draws cards and it can give you plus actions like a village. So if you manage to play a Bureaucrat, then odds are pretty good that they might have one of these in their hand because it's a nice engine component. And it can really stink when your engine components start getting top-decked, especially because the opponent might not have a choice, right? You're not asking them to top-deck a card, you're forcing them to top-deck the Nobles, and that could actually be quite bad for them. I'm focusing on Nobles here and Mill. While there are other types of mixed victory cards, it's only really Mill and Nobles in particular, out of all of them, where you would actually care a lot whether or not it got top-decked, because those are the sorts of cards that they might want to use right now. To have your only village top-decked, for example, can be pretty bad sometimes. So that's a thing that Bureaucrat could do. Another thing is that sometimes you have these games where most of your deck is going to be victory cards. So these are what we call slogs. You're buying victory cards pretty early, and you're going to buy a lot of them. So Bureaucrat can hit quite a lot in these decks because you have a very high density of victory cards. But the problem is that in your traditional slog, where you're just looking to buy one card every turn and it's a victory card, Bureaucrat isn't necessarily going to be very good in these decks, and that is because if you're playing a slog, then you're not churning through your deck very often. So you're not playing Bureaucrat very often, and the extra silver doesn't matter that much because you don't see it very often, and when you do draw Bureaucrat, well, that's a card in your hand that's not helping you. It's not generating you any money this turn, so you're going to have a bad turn. I'm assuming here, of course, that the slog is good enough that both players are trying to do it. If your opponent, of course, plays poorly and goes for a slog where it's no good, and you have this nice engine, yeah, you can hurt their deck by drawing the Bureaucrat every turn and playing it, but you probably would have won anyway, even without the Bureaucrat, if the correct thing was to not play the slog, but play the engine instead. You've already won, so, you know. If you have more than 2 players, then you can find that sometimes there are these sloggy games, people are rushing for points, and Bureaucrat can be good in these, like particularly 4-player, it's quite hard to build engines, so you can find that there are games that sort of much more incentivize this sort of situation where Bureaucrat can be good, and of course your opponent can get multiple cards top-decked if everyone's playing it. You can get group-think situations where a group of players all start to think that Bureaucrat is good because they play in a certain way, and they sort of self-reinforce that it's good. The truth is, is that Bureaucrat isn't necessarily going to be that great for them anyway, and it sort of requires coordinated effort with everyone to be playing Bureaucrat to end up in this sort of situation. So you may never see it. It depends on who you're playing with, I guess. Like all attacks, it can be better in 2-player, but that doesn't mean that it actually is any good. And all of these things, while they are nice, we really need to consider that it's not just the attack, it's gaining you the silver too. So even if you find a way to try and make the attack work, what are you going to do about the silvers that it's getting you? Or what if you just want to play Bureaucrat as a silver gainer? Like, is that actually good? Well, sometimes you can get decks that make use of that silver. So one thing you can do is you can look to trash your silvers. So here's an example of a card, Apprentice. Apprentice is +1 action, you trash a card, and then it converts that card's cost into card draw. So when Apprentice trashes a silver, you're going to draw 3 cards, and that could be quite nice. It's fuel for cost-relevant trashers. You have Storyteller from Adventures. This is a card that turns money from treasures into draw, so it lets you play treasures during your action phase. So Storyteller likes having lots of silvers because they're sort of like laboratories with Storyteller. And hey, a card that gains you laboratories is pretty good. Here's another example, Seer from Renaissance. This is very good at drawing cards that cost between 2 and 4, and Bureaucrat costs 4 and silver costs 3. So while you're focusing on buying Seers, you can have a Bureaucrat that's building up money. Seer is a interesting card in that you actually want to have a lot of silvers to generate most of your money because it's so good at drawing them. Very few cards are really good at drawing silvers in the way that Seer is. There are other examples of when you would want a lot of silvers, but I'm just giving these. There are more. We're not going to spend too long on it. We can talk more about them when we talk about those individual cards themselves. But the overall point here is that Bureaucrat, it's a bad card. So it does 2 things, and it does them pretty poorly, and they're not really that very good. As a silver gainer, Bureaucrat is just not good at doing it. You can do better. So it tends to lose out against other similar silver gainers. The attack itself is very poor a lot of the time. It usually misses, and even when it does hit, it's not that bad. And this means that Bureaucrat is just one of the worst cards across all of Dominion and all of the expansions. It's certainly the worst card in the base set. You won't gain it most of the time that it's available. Now, is it like a bottom 10 card? It could be argued that it's not, but it's pretty close either way. Bureaucrat overall, it's bad, and you don't want it. Don't add it to your deck is usually the correct call a lot of the time. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go over to the online client, and we are going to generate some kingdoms that include Bureaucrat, and we're going to assess how good it is for the kingdom. So what have we got here? We've got very good trashing with Chapel and Sentry. Are there any villages? There are not. So you're only going to play 1 terminal once you finish with Chapel. And what's that going to be? It's probably going to be Militia, because there's no draw. Militia will really hurt your opponent. If they try and go Council Room, then that's super great for you. And this is just some sort of horrible Militia over and over again. Now, gaining a lot of silvers is really bad when you're being hit by Militia. What you want is a lot of golds. So you stay well clear of Bureaucrat here. This is a bad board for Bureaucrat, because you're just trying to play militias every turn and get golds and buy provinces, and that's sort of all you really can do here. It's a very weak board, but the trashing is good enough. It lets you you got to go money even though there's Militia. Maybe you get some poachers as well. But you definitely do not want Bureaucrat there. What's happening here? So we have no trashing at all. What's our draw? It is Council Room and Village. You can probably get that to work. There is Militia as well, so you need quite a lot, but you have got Artisan to gain Council Rooms, so you're going to try and get a lot of villages, a lot of Council Rooms, and even though you have your 10... there is trashing, there is Moneylender. Okay, so you're only going to have estates, so you can draw all the way up. and then once you've drawn up, you're going to play militia, and your opponent's going to discard down to 3 cards in hand. Now, unfortunately, that means that when they discard, Bureaucrat, it's not going to find any victory cards to hit. Now, admittedly, because you are drawing them up cards with Council Room, actually the Bureaucrat could hit your opponent. You draw them up to have a 7, 8 or 9 card hand, you play the Bureaucrat, and then you play the militia and you hit your opponent. Now, I guess the only problem here is that you've got villages and you want to play council rooms. You would rather much play bandit to get golds instead of silvers. The attack is actually pretty weak, but you also are trying to play like artisan, militia, council room, bandit, moneylender. You just don't have enough village support for this, and so Bureaucrat actually misses out. It struggles to be relevant here because you've got other stuff you'd rather play and you just can't spare the terminal space for it. So Bureaucrat there's just a better treasure gainer, and the attack doesn't really matter. Even though it's a bit more likely to hit, you're still not going to do it anyway. And so that's this game. Bureaucrat is no good here, unfortunately. This is going to be a common theme, as you will see. So what's going on here? So we have Festival as our village. We have Moneylender as our only trashing again. That's fine. We have Laboratory and Smithy for draw. We have Market. We have Vassal. Does Vassal work here? I guess so. So we are going to... I think Vassal is probably going to be better than Silver. Yeah, it is, because it draws you a bit more. So you really want to... You've got Festival, you've got Vassal, you've got Market. You really don't want very many treasures, if any at all, here. So you do not want to play Bureaucrat. You do not want those silvers. You can't trash them when you've got them. And you want as few as you possibly can. You might even open Moneylender Vassal rather than opening with a silver to try and help you get up to your first 5. The Moneylender will help, the Vassal will be nice later, and then you're going to buy this stuff, and you're eventually going to buy Province. Bureaucrat, the attack, even though you can't get rid of the estates, the attack doesn't really matter that much. You should be able to draw reasonably well eventually, and, you know... it's irrelevant. The silvers actively hurt you here, and you can't do anything about it when you've got them. You really don't want them. Draw is not strong enough with Festival as your only village, and so you really need to rely on like Vassal, and Vassal doesn't have any ways to guarantee hitting something, so you want as much of a density of action cards as you can have. So silver's particularly bad in this kingdom, and that is why you avoid Bureaucrat. What's going on here? So we can trash down with Sentry. We've also got Remodel to get rid of estates, so Bureaucrat's going to do absolutely nothing for a while, but we're going to be using Sentry mostly. Workshop, is it any good? He's got a merchant, it's fine. There's no village here is the problem. So what you're going to do is you're going to have Sentry to trash down. You are going to have Market, and you're probably going to get a bunch of merchants. I think you sort of go for a cantrip kingdom with markets and merchants, and eventually you play a Remodel as your one terminal, and you will use that to churn through provinces, and maybe like you buy a gold and you can remodel the gold. But what you want to do is you want to have exactly 1 silver, and you want to play a load of merchants and a load of markets and a load of sentries, and you play most of your cards like that, and then at the end you're just using some remodel tricks to try and win the tie breaks. And you want to keep fairly clean of stock cards, and that means you do not want Bureaucrat. And because you are getting rid of all of your estates as early as you can, Bureaucrat will do nothing, and the silvers actively get in the way. So you do not want Bureaucrat. It's particularly bad for you here. And by particularly bad, I mean exactly the same as every other kingdom we've looked at where it's really bad. So this is the last one. What have we got going on here? Well, we have Festival for Village. We have Witch, so there's a junking attack. And what is the trashing? Well, it's only remodel and mine. So that's really bad. We've also got Militia as well. There's like all of the attacks going on here. What do we want to do? Well, we want to Witch big money, I think, because Festival's really bad with Witch as a village, and you can't get rid of the coppers. And there's nothing that you want to turn the estates into either, honestly. So this is a Witch big money board, and I think you eventually get a Militia. Maybe you start with a Militia and you look to get Witches. And yeah, that's kind of it, really. I don't think you do anything else. Yeah, it's just like Militia, Witch, big money. I guess the Militia's not so good when your opponent's filled with curses. So yeah, you just want to give your opponent the junk, and whoever does that first kind of wins. Maybe you go on to Bandit, but you certainly wouldn't bother with Bureaucrat. It doesn't top deck curses, only victory cards, and curse is not a victory card. Here, see, it doesn't say victory on it. So that means that Bureaucrat's really bad here. There are better ways if you want to gain a bunch of treasures to do that. The attack doesn't make any difference. Terminal space is limited, and it's pretty weak one at that. So, yep. So there you go. Bureaucrat, completely ignorable in all 5 kingdoms. It's really bad. Don't buy it in 2-player. You very, very rarely, if ever, want it. Terrible card. Anyway, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.